Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making Remote Work. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Roderick Swaaab, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at INSEAD. Roderick, welcome to Making Remote Work.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show. Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Roderick, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your research?
Of course, yes. Pleasure. So I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I studied at the University of Amsterdam, where in my dissertation actually started already with an interest actually in understanding like what makes negotiators actually perform well. And over the years, actually, and that's been more than 20 years ago. And over the years, I've been fascinated by two overarching questions, and that is on the one hand, actually, like how do communication channels actually, how we actually, meet with others, like in person, on the phone, or over email. How do those like channels interact with, our orientation in a negotiation to compete or cooperate, right? To influence, like also like the quality of our outcomes. My second line of research focuses actually on the role of hierarchy and hierarchical differences in teams, and how that actually affects like conflict, coordination, and performance in groups and also in negotiations.
So this would be quite interesting for the audience. As I wrote to you, there were a lot of questions on negotiating or working with customers, on dealing with all sorts of conflictual situations at work. So I think this would be kind of an interest for practitioners of remote and employees that have now been forced to work remotely. But let me start with asking you a bit about how you see this COVID-19 pandemic situation and how this influences how we do things right now, from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think one thing actually that we clearly see in the current crisis is actually the acceleration and the adoption of virtual and online tools. Right? So video conferencing, phone, text, chat, etc. Right? And so we all experience this rapid acceleration actually in the adoption of like online technologies due to the pandemic. And so, in the past few months alone, like video conferencing apps like Zoom and also others actually have been downloaded by more than a factor of 20, right? So very rapid like increase. Also, actually, I just looked it up actually on Google Trends. You see also that like things like Zoom, was a more popular search term actually in March, April than COVID-19, right? So it's clearly suggests that people try to understand like what to do now, right? We have to do things different.
So because we will go into depth into negotiation, can we, and then we will go into the use of technology, right, during negotiation as well, because there are differences. But can we get everyone on the same page on what you study about negotiation and what's important in negotiation?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think first actually, so one more thing I wanted to say actually about the current situation is that I think many people kind of seem to make a mistake actually that this trend towards like or this shift towards like using more technology would also actually bring about like more impersonal and impoverished like business interactions and negotiations, right? So Zoom fatigue actually clearly has kicked in, and also like some of our surveys confirm actually that managers believe that face-to-face negotiations are still required, and that to get to an optimal deal actually we need eye contact, we need to meet in person, we need to be able to shake hands, right? And so what is actually interesting actually is that our own research kind of like defies some of like this widespread belief that we always need like face-to-face contact actually to do well, right? In fact, our research shows that virtual negotiations can be equally and sometimes even more effective than in-person ones, right? So the question then is really like, how do we use some of this research, right, in this domain to better understand kind of the strengths and weaknesses actually that different like communication channels and virtual like online tools actually bring about to negotiate more superior deals. Now, and I think actually this is very important to address because and very useful to understand because even though in some economies or in some countries actually we see that the situation is actually improving slightly, these safe distancing measures actually will still actually apply, right? And the quickest vaccine also in history, what was it, like took over 4 years actually to develop. So the virtual tools actually are here to stay for the time being, right? And I suspect also for much longer than that. So we have to also kind of better understand like what the impact is and how we can use actually these communication channels, in a more optimal way. So as you asked me, like, what are some of the basics, right? And so because I already mentioned, like, what are, we strive for superior deals, but what exactly, do we mean by that, right? So in negotiations more generally, a high quality deal can be defined in two ways, right? So first, a high quality outcome actually can refer to successfully reaching an agreement when there is one or more possible agreements that would make both parties actually better off, rather than walking away, right, from the table, which would leave potentially both parties worse off than if a deal had been reached. The second way, actually, we define like a high quality deal is that when it involves actually reaching an agreement that expands the total amount of resources available to both parties, right? And so we often refer to this as joint gain or a win-win outcome. Right? By looking into the underlying preferences actually of both sides, actually we realize that we can make some trade-offs actually and both be better off. So that's really what we actually focus on actually, and what we mean when we define like or when we refer to superior deals. Now, whether or not we can achieve such outcomes depends very heavily actually on the extent to which we are willing and able to share and exchange information with our counterpart. And note that also that I don't say our opponent, I always talk about counterpart, right? It's a subtle difference, but also important, right? Because we are not just there for ourselves in a negotiation. And so this is also work actually that was done by three very famous like Dutch psychologists, Karsten de Dreux, Bernard Neustadt, and Daan van Knippenberg, who came up with this motivated information processing theory. And that also, suggests that a lot of what we do in the context of negotiations and in making decisions depends actually on people's ability and willingness actually to share information actually effectively. So this led then also us to question, like, how do different communication channels, not just face-to-face, but also alternative channels actually, how do they actually influence our ability to share and integrate information, which is so essential, right, for these high quality outcomes to emerge? Now, when I talk about like communication channels, there are a number of different channels actually that we can think of, right? So very often actually when we talk about different communication channels, we think about like how they can vary in terms of like what we call richness or the potential to convey the sensation of social presence, right? So now we are actually in a Zoom session and I can see you not actually, and it makes it very easy to coordinate, right, our behavior, when to speak or when to actually be quiet, right? And so that can be very important in a negotiation, right? So a phone conversation may allow you to feel psychologically close to someone else actually on the other side of the world. Likewise, video conferencing actually that also adds some visual cues to conversation may contribute even more to that feeling, right, of being both kind of socially present. So on the other hand, actually the impersonal nature of like sometimes like email exchanges actually can leave some of us actually feeling also distant at times. Yeah. So that's one way actually to think about like these communication channels, right? So they vary on a spectrum actually of how rich they are. Now, can we meet in person? If not, actually, can we see the other side or hear the other side? The second dimension actually on which these communication channels tend to differ is the level of synchronicity, right? So the extent to which like individuals kind of work on the same activity at the same time. Right? So phone calls, video conferences, but also like WhatsApp chats allow us also to respond instantaneously to what someone else actually has to say. Right? Whereas like asynchronous media such as email, voicemail, and even fax messages, for those who still remember that actually, they actually cause this delay. Right? So, and very often we also hear, these ideas that, asynchronous media, like email, can create a lot of problems, right? And there are some very famous examples actually of like how they cause like sometimes even disasters, right? So I remember actually in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in the US, uh, where it turned out actually that some of the Federal Emergency Management Agency employees actually missed out on some really important opportunities to coordinate more effectively that then caused a lot of delay in how quickly they could assist because they were actually coordinating mostly over email. So that is just one example, right? But we can think of lots of different examples actually of how like email actually can create all these difficulties. So that's just to say, what we mean actually by superior deals in negotiations, what is important. but also actually, what communication channels actually tend to capture, at least in our view.
So which one is the best? Is it video? Is it chat?
Yes. So for a very long time, right? So that's an interesting question. So for a very long time, um, at least when you look at the research, there was a very clear assumption actually that face-to-face communication channels and richer channels that, for example, enable us also to see the other side, or even hear the other side, would be really critical actually for very complex tasks like negotiations or group decision-making tasks, where we need to kind of like combine our expertise to make like a more optimal decision. So the assumption was actually, the more complex your task, also the richer the channel actually you need. So there was actually, this strong assumption actually that technology would really determine whether we would interact successfully or not. Right? It all depends actually on what sort of channel that we have available. So although this, idea kind of makes intuitive sense, and also when we, survey, executives also at INSEAD, and we ask them actually, what they think actually is the best, like, channel to negotiate. Still there is this idea actually that we like to think that, meeting in person actually is superior. And so we see actually a very different picture actually when we look at the scientific evidence. Right? So despite this idea making intuitive sense, we love face-to-face. My colleagues and I actually found that it doesn't really square with what the research actually shows. In fact, what we found was that the prior research actually was all over the place, with some studies actually showing that indeed sometimes richer contact, like having a video conferencing or an in-person meeting, is indeed like better to achieve like a higher quality negotiation outcome. Other times, actually, we found that it didn't really make a difference. And again, other times we found the exact opposite was true, that we negotiate better in the absence of face-to-face contact or in the absence of visual channels, such as in video conferences.
So how is that explained? How can we explain that? And
Yeah, so that's exactly what my colleagues and I also wanted to try to explain, like how is this even possible, right? So clearly we don't see much support for this kind of intuition that a lot of people have actually, that richer channels are always better, right? And so rather than assuming that technology determines really how we behave, what we did is we went actually back to the research that I mentioned before by Karsten de Dreux and his colleagues, that suggests actually that in order to reach an optimal deal, actually we need to share and integrate information effectively. Now, they also say in their work, and they also show in their work, that whether or not we can do this strongly depends also on whether people seek to cooperate or compete with others in their negotiation, right? So we have like these orientations to either compete or cooperate, and sometimes we don't know, right? So some people actually tend to adopt a very cooperative approach to their negotiation. There could be many different reasons for that, right? Because of their personality traits, because of the context actually in which they operate, because they expect like future interaction actually with the other side. But some people, would on average actually tend to approach negotiations in a more cooperative way. Other people, on the other hand, tend to have a more competitive approach. And it could be because they share a very competitive history actually with the other side, but it could be other reasons to that. And finally, actually, there are others actually who are unsure, right, about like what sort of approach to take. Should I cooperate? Should I compete? Right? I don't
yeah,
know, right?
yeah.
And so these orientations, what we thought, are very consequential because more cooperative orientations, they lead negotiators also to seek, share, and integrate information more effectively to benefit both themselves as well as others. Whereas more competitive orientations, they refer to an approach where people really strive to maximize kind of their own outcomes, right? Claim as much value from the deal as possible. And it also actually goes hand in hand with them trying to withhold information, right, that could potentially benefit others. They also don't trust these others. So what we did is actually we put these two kind of ideas together, right? So based on the finding, on the one hand, that information exchange and coordination is so critical, right, for the quality of negotiation deals. And on the other hand, actually the finding that people's orientations to cooperate or compete determine whether they're willing and able to do so. My colleagues and I actually suspected that this could also help explain these mixed findings actually that we saw about the effects of communication channels in negotiations. So to better understand how negotiators also navigate the tension between cooperation and competition, what we did, especially when they don't meet face to face, what we decided to do was to take stock of the empirical evidence, right, and look at all the published research in this area and also unpublished research in this area. And then actually, so we looked only for experimental research where the researchers brought in like large groups of students or participants, put them into a negotiation simulation, and had them actually negotiate on the phone, in person, over email, over WhatsApp, you name it. Right? Synchronous or asynchronous channels with either visual or vocal channels. And so then we went very carefully through all these studies to indicate, whether the people in that study had either a cooperative orientation or a competitive orientation, or whether they were unsure. Yeah. And so what we found was actually quite interesting. And to some extent, there were also some interesting surprises, actually. So first of all, actually, we found indeed, consistent with this idea that richer is always better, we found indeed that like face-to-face and richer channels were better when negotiators do not know each other well and faced also more complex negotiations. And by more complex negotiations, I mean very complicated negotiations in the sense that they involve like very challenging and difficult issues to resolve, but also actually when they involve multiple parties, not just two, but sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 different parties. So under those situations, actually, we found that richer channels and even face-to-face contact was still superior. You can imagine also that under these sort of situations, visual and vocal and synchronous contact actually serves a very important function. Right? So think about it like the presence of this non-semantic information, such as nodding your head or smiling or briefly verbalizing actually, things like yeah or to affirm actually that you understand what I said. Even your tone of voice and facial expressions, these can be quite important, right? To figure out whether you can actually trust the other side enough and whether it's safe enough actually to share and integrate some information with them. So we found indeed that the presence of all these channels and face-to-face contact resulted in more optimal outcomes and better quality deals when the negotiators did not know each other well, when they were involved like in multi-party negotiations, or when the negotiation itself was very complex. So that was the first part, right? So yes, sometimes actually more and richer is actually better. At the same time, we also found actually that in some situations, there is absolutely no difference. Right? And here it gets a little bit more interesting and less intuitive also for everyone. So we found actually that face-to-face contact and richer channels did not have much of an impact on the quality of a deal when the negotiators themselves were already more cooperatively predisposed before going into the negotiation. And that could be because they knew each other. They had already built trust a long time ago, or they shared like common like social ties. They were part of the same social network, or some worked for the same company or the same organization. Right? And so when they already knew each other and already had like this cooperative like history or some like indication that they could cooperate, we actually found that it didn't really matter whether they negotiated over email, over the phone, or in person. Right? And so you can imagine that the tendency actually to enter negotiations with trust and rapport actually made it easier also for them to exchange information more freely, and made them also less dependent actually on all these like cues that are conveyed by the communication channel itself. So finally, we find also actually that sometimes face-to-face contact and richer channels like video conferencing were actually worse. And we found that it was actually the case when negotiators had a very competitive orientation. So in disputes, when they were really trying to seek or trying to maximize the amount of value that they could claim from the negotiation as much as possible. But also actually when they had a very competitive relationship, or perhaps like were involved like in a dispute prior to the negotiation.
How is that
So,
possible? How
so
does
yeah,
that happen?
so I think what is important here is that, to also think a little bit about like, what does the communication channel do with us, right? When we actually start to interact with others. And so face-to-face contact, but also richer channels like phone conversations, video conversations, not only help us actually transmit factual information, but they also actually can intensify the feelings, right? For better or worse. And so what we see here actually in this particular group of studies actually where people came into the negotiation with a more competitive motive, competitive orientation, the presence actually of visual like channels or vocal channels, they escalated the already existing competitive predispositions that they had and made it even more difficult to exchange information.
Okay,
So
so
in other
is it more
words,
like I see your face and yeah, I'm already angry and I don't want to do it? And why is that? It's very funny.
exactly, right? So you already associate, my presence actually with, you have this very negative connotation actually, even when
Okay,
you think of me and my presence, right? And then when on top of that, actually, you also have to face me literally on a video screen or in person. You can imagine actually that that triggers a lot of anxiety and
okay,
also perhaps like escalates like negative emotions even further. So, for example, I've studied this also in the context actually of labor and family disputes in the Netherlands, together with the Dutch Mediation Association. And there, actually, we found that there's a very small group of mediators, professional mediators, who understands this, perhaps intuitively, or they also read, some of this research. And so, what they actually did was, before bringing in disputants into the common room where they would all sit together, they would actually separate them. They would restrict them actually from seeing each other, actually from having any sort of contact. And then they would actually try to actually make them feel less anxious, uh, like mitigate some of the negative
train them a
emotions
bit.
actually already before they all would come into the main room. Likewise, actually, there's some interesting research by Katalin Bollan from Maastricht University and Martin Ouwema from the Katholieke Universiteit in Leuven that also shows actually that in highly emotional like disputes in divorces, actually, more indirect channels such as email, they're actually more effective in producing a settlement that both sides also feel is acceptable. Right? So in these situations, negotiators or disputants are better off restricting their contact and also face-to-face communication and involve like an intermediary, right? Could be actually a professional mediator, but it could also be someone's manager. Right?
Very interesting. Roderick, does it matter how much if I negotiate with you and I know how to use video or Zoom and certain features of Zoom extremely well, would it influence the outcome of the negotiation in my favor if because I just know how to use the technology better,
Absolutely.
or if I write better email I'm faster with chat?
Yes, absolutely. So we do see this actually, and so at INSEAD I teach a course which is called Negotiation Dynamics, and when I teach this for our MBA students, actually what I have them do is also I ask them actually to complete a couple of these simulations, actually these exercises with each other, but then over WhatsApp, right? Or sometimes it's over email. And what I what I do is I actually analyze their data. I ask them actually to share the details actually of their conversations with me, and I analyze these conversations, and I use some linguistic software and also like some typing patterns actually to see if they predict actually their outcomes. And so what I see here, among other things, is very clearly actually your kind of like uh, idea that if you indeed like master the technology better, if you know how to use the technology better than your counterpart, it does potentially give you an advantage in a negotiation. Now, whether you or not you're willing to use that advantage, that's another question. But we do see also that, for example, in WhatsApp negotiations, that the person actually who types a little faster than their counterpart now can dominate the conversation also more into their favor, right? Which makes also sense, right? If you have better arguments and better prepared and also like a little faster actually than your counterpart, then that comes with an advantage. And we clearly see evidence actually of this. Like something as simple as typing speed actually seems to matter, right? In some situations.
Uh, do we? What's our default, or is there something like this? What's the average negotiation strategy? Do people look more for win-win, or would they be more competitive?
Yeah, so that's so. I think most people. So this depends a little bit. So it varies a little bit by culture, personality. But when you look at large surveys actually of like people's value orientations in negotiations, it's most people actually, or about half of the people, at least in my samples actually that I do, when I ask these questions at INSEAD with our students, it's a little bit less than half of the people actually that indicated they're very cooperative. Right? So about 40% actually indicated they have a very strong cooperative orientation, and they'll try to do whatever they can actually to also accommodate the other side. Another 40% or so actually indicates that they seek to strive for outcomes actually that are good for themselves, but not necessarily hurt the other side. Right? And then you have a very small group of people, the remaining 10 to 20% or so, that actually indicates that they really seek also to maximize some of these differences. Now, again, this is like a biased sample. Like at INSEAD, actually, our students are from all over the world. These are business administration students actually that have negotiation experience. So one question is like, how representative is it actually of the general population? I don't think actually these numbers differ that much actually from the general population, but clearly you also see that personality traits actually have an effect here. So, for example, one of the personality traits that seems to actually be linked to this somehow is the extent to which we are agreeable. Right? So people who are very high on agreeableness actually place a lot of value on getting along well with others. And so you also see actually that people very high on the spectrum actually tend to actually make a few more concessions maybe than they should be. And people very low on the spectrum actually, they tend to be more disagreeable. Actually, they focus also more on getting good outcomes actually for
For
themselves.
themselves?
So it's in a very international context, we see that it's kind of like split with a very small minority actually with a very competitive orientation. But it also depends on our personality traits and perhaps also on our cultural values.
How can we, and how can someone who's listening make a remote negotiation or a remote conflict discussion go towards a win-win, right? When you are describing what a win-win means for you, where both parties have extended resources and they actually can get way more better deals out of it, it feels like that's should be the aim, right? But remote is also, at least it's considered less empathetic because we might not know the other side so well. We might not gain trust so easily. Um, I've discussed with a few other researchers, and apparently if we are remote and we don't know the other party, we always think us versus them. So it feels that it's harder to get a win-win remote. How can the negotiation be set up? How can people interact? How can they build trust so they strive for a win-win?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think like the research that I just mentioned before, and our findings actually, although these findings provide like very detailed insight into when face-to-face or richer channels actually help or hurt, uh, and a very important shortcoming actually of all these studies is that they are conducted in a laboratory actually where people do a negotiation exercise and never meet again. Right? Now the real world doesn't work like that, right? We often like meet again, or we may meet someone actually that we negotiated before. So our reputation really matters, right? In this sort of situation, and we have like multiple rounds actually of negotiations. The other thing actually that is different in the real world is that we actually typically have the option to select multiple channels, right? Not just one channel, because in these experiments actually you only had face to face or only WhatsApp, right? And in the real world we can use like lots of different channels. So our follow-up work actually reveals that these insights can also be used actually both in a sequential way as negotiators enter different stages of the negotiation, but also simultaneously within a specific stage. So let me clarify that. Right. So sequentially, I think what our research so far like implies is that when we negotiate online, we need to think very carefully, and assuming that we have choice in terms of like the channels, we need to consider very carefully actually when to choose which channel. right? And that depends actually on two factors in our view. So first of all, it depends on the relationship that we have with the other side, yeah? Such that when it's the first meeting that we will ever have with this person, when we don't know the other side, yes, face-to-face contact actually is better. But if it's not possible, uh, then go to the next best option or the rich option, which is video conferencing, which is also better actually than on the phone. And the phone is better again than over email, right? So we clearly see actually some evidence for that. Now, also when the relationship is fairly cooperative already, it doesn't really matter. And as I mentioned before, when it's very hostile and competitive, actually more indirect ways actually to communicate actually are better.
Mhm.
So we can also think about this sequentially, right? It's not just a one-off negotiation where you may be more competitive or more cooperative. This cooperative or competitive mood may also change over time as you negotiate with the same sort of person. So choose the channel also based on the relationship with the other side. Also think about like choosing the channel carefully actually as the negotiation actually gets more complex. So we also find actually that when the negotiation is more complex, involves like very complex multiple issues, richer channels actually are better. When they're pretty straightforward, fewer issues, it doesn't really seem to matter as much, right? So we can think about this also actually as a toolkit, and we can pick and choose like different channels, like for different stages in the negotiation. Now, what if we cannot select the channel, right? I think that also goes back to your question, like if we're stuck with online and virtual tools. So even when it's not possible to meet in person, we actually find that having a video or a phone conference actually to establish rapport and a bit of trust actually is preferable to starting with an email negotiation right away. And so this is research actually that was done quite a while ago already. It's like 15 years ago, even more than that, by Michael Morris from Columbia University. And where he actually showed that another method actually to prepare for email negotiations is to become acquainted and before we really start. And so what they did in their studies was that they had like MBA students from Stanford and Kellogg negotiate with each other over email. But in one group, they actually had a quick phone conversation before they started the negotiation to get to know each other. Whereas actually in the control group, they did not have that, and they had that actually over email. And so what they found was actually that small talk conversation actually that they had on the phone was sufficient actually to establish a more cooperative tone in the email negotiation. Now, this small talk was not sufficient to translate ultimately into better outcomes. And we also find actually in some other research that we've done is that it is sufficient actually when you also couple this actually with some common goals actually in the negotiation. What do you want to have achieved actually for both of you, right? These sort of conversations. So we can get acquainted actually before we start, right? Try with a perhaps like not a face-to-face conversation, but at least with a phone conversation. Also, actually, even older research actually that was done by Don Moore and Terry Kurtzberg and Lee Thompson, and also Michael Morris, showed that getting to know each other, but also actually highlighting actually the commonalities between my group and your group. So avoiding kind of like these in-out group kind of like distinctions also really went a long way actually to get people to establish a more cooperative orientation. So they actually found that in the context of email negotiations, that when we highlight that we're members of the same group, same organization, same university, uh, or when we engage in some mutual disclosure, self-disclosure before we start, that can then be sufficient actually to already be willing to cooperate more and also kind of like find like better deals over time within that email negotiation. So that is one way, right? So we can actually try to get acquainted before we actually start the
Carry out.
negotiation over email or in a text-based format. Now, you can push that logic even further and you can wonder like, well, what if it's not possible to have that phone conversation, right? Before we actually do start the email negotiation. So here what we find actually is that we really need to also think about like the words that we use in our email or in our WhatsApp conversations, right? So if it's not possible, to meet before the negotiation starts, you can also actually frame the content of your communication more carefully to frame the exchange actually in a more constructive way. So for example, what we found actually in several studies is that when we use more collective frames of reference, such as, and use plural pronouns, such as we, us, and ours, and we can use it very selectively, we also actually find, and we do this especially early in the conversation, we also see that it sets the tone actually in a much more cooperative way, which then eventually helps the parties also to share or feel a little bit safer in terms of like sharing information and then finding also more creative agreements. We've also done actually studies at INSEAD where we instructed negotiators who were negotiating online. This was in the context actually of job negotiations, to mimic each other's language over, in an online conversation. And so if you use certain jargon, right, I would do the same. If you would use certain words, I do the same. But of course, we don't overdo it. Right? And so we gave these negotiators these instructions to mimic their counterpart actually, strategically. And especially actually, and we also looked at, whether they did it at the beginning, at the middle, or at the end of their negotiation. And actually, what we find is that when we strategically mimic the jargon of the other side, especially early in the negotiation, not late, we find the same sort of like effects, right? Such that mimicking, the other side actually, in a subtle way, also kind of creates some cooperative momentum. And why? Because without really thinking about it, you feel that I'm more like you, simply because I mimic you a bit more. And because you feel that I'm more like you feel a bit safer actually to share some information, which I can then use to find more creative agreements. So this is, I think we can do a lot actually in terms of like selecting certain words and selecting certain like kind of emotional words actually to promote a more positive and more cooperative tone. So the key finding here is really that you would want to enrich your relationship as much as possible, even when you cannot use a rich communication channel. So I mentioned like how we can use like different channels sequentially, but we can also use them simultaneously. So we've done like some more recent research actually that also highlights the advantage actually of being able to use multiple tools at the same time. So for example, if you are interviewing me for a job, I can also have my computer open and look at my preparation actually. And as we start to exchange offers, I can see actually how good these offers are given where I started. We've also done work actually on team negotiations where everyone was actually working in a different location, completely virtual. And so there we actually found that, that it's not so much actually whether you can see the other side. So that was always fixed. So they always saw each other actually over video conferencing. But we also gave them the option to communicate within their team, right? So there was 3 versus 3, and the 3 members on one team could also they had a WhatsApp chat open. And in that WhatsApp chat, actually, they were also communicating and coordinating. And so we find actually that, when we have that WhatsApp chat open and we prepare very carefully actually for, the roles that we all play, someone being the lead speaker, someone being the number cruncher, we actually see that those sort of teams that multi-communicate or use multiple channels actually also slightly outperform face-to-face team.
This is all very fascinating. Very quick question. Because I read some and listened to some videos on how to communicate remotely, and a lot of them say that showing hands, making eye contact, using emoticons actually help build trust. Did you do any kind of research on that? Is it true or not? Because it's harder to do online. Some easier like emoticons, but still you're not showing emotions.
So we did. So we actually, together with my father, who is a neurobiologist, we actually teamed up at some point and also published some research and did some research and published that actually on the role of eye contact in video conferencing negotiations. And there we see actually that it depends actually very much. Right? It depends actually on how comfortable people are making eye contact. And so what we did is we had a special setup actually with a device that enabled video conferences, but it also enabled you actually to make eye contact or have a typical video conferencing conversation like we have now, and we don't really know whether the other side is making eye contact. It could be, or it could not be the case, right? And so it leaves you a little bit uncertain. And so what we find there actually in that research is that it strongly depends actually on whether or not you are comfortable actually with making eye contact. And specifically in this research, we looked at the role of gender. And then there's a lot of research actually that also suggests that when two men actually negotiate, they associate also they're a bit more sensitive to making eye contact, and they interpret this staring or eye contact or excessive like eye contact also as like strong attempts actually to dominate the other side, as opposed to not making that eye contact. Whereas women actually don't feel the strong like negative emotions actually with excessive eye contact. And so based on this earlier research and consistent with that, also we found actually that for men actually making eye contact very salient. For men who did not know each other, that's a very important qualifier. Who men who did not know each other actually, it made them think more of the fact that the other side actually was trying to kind of cheat them or mislead them, and therefore they responded actually more positively when we kind of like muted that eye contact. I then put it like in a similar, or in a traditional like video conferencing setting. Whereas actually for the women in our study, actually they, it didn't hurt them at all. In fact, it seemed to help them a little bit. So I think I think we need to be very careful, right, in kind of like overstating some of these claims that one technology or one specific action is always better. As we know, it always depends, right? And it's important to also understand what it depends on. So what we find is that these richer communication channels, their effect really depends on the relationship that people have, but it also depends actually on people's preferences actually using that technology.
Roderick, I know the time is near that we end this conversation, but I did find one of your studies really, really interesting. And that was about remote negotiations and how to influence the majority, right? So if you are a minority and you do feel strong about your opinions, but you cannot make the other party see and hear your voice, how do you make that happen? Can you say something about that?
Yes, yeah. So this is research that I've done actually with my colleagues, Kathy Phillips and Michael Shearer, and where we studied also like minority influence, right? And what we typically see is that minority members actually have a very hard time making their voices heard in group discussions. And that is because there is, on the one hand, actually a strong pressure from the majority actually to push the minority member in a particular way, but also because minority members actually simply because they have like the only or minority opinion, right? The only different opinion, they may also start to question themselves, right, and doubt themselves whether their opinion is indeed like the correct opinion. And so what they do, as many of us actually do, they conform, right, to the group norm. And so this can be, and conformity is not something bad, right? In many situations, it's actually very helpful. We wouldn't be able to get along as a society actually, and as a group actually, if we wouldn't conform to some extent. But it can be bad, right? And a lot of like group decision-making settings actually, so let's imagine like a hiring situation where you need to select which job candidate actually to make an offer to. And imagine that you are making a decision between three different like candidates, and they all come with like unique attributes, but it turns out actually that the minority member has a little bit more information or more accurate information. So in other words, the minority opinion is actually a bit better, a bit like more precise and a bit more accurate. So under those sort of situations actually where the minority member actually is right, the rest of the group is wrong, you can imagine actually that these conformity pressures can actually be really bad, right? Because then they will just agree with whatever the majority says, so the majority member actually will, try to, sway their opinion in another direction. So what we've done actually in these, and so the question here is like, how do we get minority members actually to speak up? So what we know actually from decades-old research is that it's incredibly difficult, right, for minority members to influence majorities. So they need to be consistent and repeat their arguments. And if they do all of that, they will get a little bit more influential, but still not so influential actually to change the group's opinion as a whole. And so what we do know from prior research is that whether or not minorities are influential does not only depend actually on how persuasive they are, but it also depends actually on the majority groups like willingness to listen to the minority. And so based on those findings, we thought, well, actually virtual teams, and especially in like in online settings, you can imagine that under certain situations, that majority members also feel kind of compelled uh, to listen to the minority member because they may not have that much power. And so specifically what we were interested in was like the opportunity to engage in secret side conversations. And so typically, what we do is we meet, or what this was kind of like the old norm, we would meet all together in a room, and it could be like in person, or it could be like in a group video conversation. And we knew that that was actually the only way we could actually interact with each other. So in other words, that would also make majority members actually feel a bit more powerful. And what we did in these experiments, actually, we also instructed the group members that they had like the opportunity to engage in side conversations with each other. So even while we would be sitting here in this video conferencing chat and all be there, we also knew that we could actually send like secret messages to each other and trying to convince the other side. And so we found actually that in those sort of settings, actually, when we really kind of like highlight the salience of these secret side conversations, that the majority was more willing also to listen to the minority opinion. And it was not because minorities actually were more vocal and were trying to use these secret side conversations actually to convince the majority members. It was because the majority actually felt less powerful to act as a united front, and therefore actually realized that they had to integrate all the different opinions more so than they would typically do.
So basically the advice would be for minorities who feel strongly about their opinion is to find the opportunity and engage in these side conversations so they can influence someone in the majority group.
So highlight that. Yes. Yeah. Highlight that and get an ally, right? So I think the moment you're not alone anymore, that changes everything.
Roderick, thank you so much. I think this has been great insights and great education on remote and not only negotiation and conflict management. Thank you so much for today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. Thank you.
I feel like we have so much more to discuss, but hey, maybe we can do another one at some point.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you so much.